So that documentary nicely ties in the way that the Black Death was affecting various parts of Europe, including the British Isles, and some of the factors that we were dealing with the church and the flagellants and all of that that was brought up here, and also the way in which Jews were treated. And again, this theme comes up all the time where minorities that are, well, in particular the Jews. I mean, this is what's kind of interesting is not the word I want to use, but okay, for now I'll say interesting. Think about this. When it comes to pagans were thoroughly, well, over the centuries, but pagans were rooted out, and they were eradicated from Europe as thoroughly as possible. Now, for all of this hatred of the Jews that would happen and the abuse that they would take, why did they survive? I mean, they were clearly a vulnerable community. Every time Christians wanted to have a mob violence against them, Jews never had a successful I don't recall any part of history where they were able to do anything about these mob actions. If they were expelled, they got expelled. If they were going to get a mob attack, that was what's going to happen. And so if Christianity wanted to actually eradicate Jews from Europe, it seems that they would be able to do it if they were able to do it with the pagans. Now, for some, this kind of this symbolizes the miraculousness, that God keeps protecting his chosen people, kind of thing. But for secular historians, of course, they're looking at other factors. And here's what I observed or I thought about this history of anti-Semitism and yet the survival of the Jews despite all of this in Europe, is that there were several treaties, which I didn't have time to go into, starting with St. Augustine. And there was actually a term for it. Oh my goodness, my head, I'm drawing a blank. But it's the idea that allowing the Jews to exist is a testimony to two things. That one, that the Bible's true, because they somehow are kind of living remnants or an example of the fact that the prophecy actually was fulfilled. It's kind of like the walking around living Old Testament or something like that. And two, the fact that they were in a humiliated, depreciated condition showed God's disfavor with them. They rejected the Messiah. I think it was called Doctrine of Witness, by the way, I think is what St. Augustine called it. So in other words, the idea would be to demote Jews to make sure that they never live fully comfortably in Christian society, but they would be able to, generally speaking, allowed to exist as a witness to proof of the Bible, the prophecies of Christianity as the successor religion, and them as the end results of people who did have it with God and lost it. And look what happened to these people who lost favor with God. Clearly God's rejected them as they rejected him, the Messiah. But then they had, all of these, things that they labeled on them. In Islam, Jesus doesn't die on the cross. So Jews cannot be accused of the killer of Jesus, because in Islam, the Jews don't kill Jesus. In Christianity, Jews are going to be considered the killers of Christ. They're going to be accused of this collectively for a long time. And on top of that, the Jews are also going to be on the radar. I mean, I just want you to think about this. If you read the Old Testament or you read the New Testament, you always are going to talk about the Jews, because the Old Testament or the Hebrew Aramaic scriptures If you hear this read, it's going to say, the term Jews or the Hebrews or ancient Israel is going to get brought up. In the New Testament, it's going to say, Jesus went to the Jews, and the Jews did this, and they did that, and they didn't. And so you're reminded, this is an ethnic group that's going to be on your radar every time you go to church. And it doesn't mean that being Christian is inherently anti-Semitic. But what I'm saying is that they were one of the few minorities, non-Christian minorities, to be allowed to thrive in Christendom, but under this major radar, right? And so when a crisis would happen, it's easy to see that even if the church didn't officially call for mob violence against Jews, it's easy to see that they would be the first scapegoat to go to. And this would be a problem that would happen for a long time. Now, in the Muslim world, there's a book on this called Under the Crescent and Cross about Jews under the Muslims and the Christians in the Middle Ages by Mark Cohen. And he points out that this whole idea of blood libels and the paranoia against Jews that took place in Europe just didn't happen. He documents it. It doesn't mean that life was 100% better, but Jews never were under the radar in that way. And plus, they also were, a minority with Christians, and they didn't have a state or competing kingdom to threaten the Islamic world. In other words, Jews having no state and being able to bring merchants that could go in and out of the Christian world and back to the Muslim world made them of value as opposed to any political threat. And they just had the approach differently. So the Quran did have comments about God's being displeased with the Jews as well as the Christians at the time. But if you remember how the political setup of Islam was, as long as Christianity and Judaism was politically subservient to the political power of Islam, they could operate relatively unharmed. For example, Christians and Jews can drink alcohol. Christians can eat pork. Muslims couldn't do either of those, and Christians and Jews were allowed to do their own thing in there. And here's the difference then that we saw in the Christian world. But again, sometimes things got really bad for minorities in the Islamic world, and sometimes things were better off in the Christian world. It just really varied from time to time. Just kind of wanted to clarify some of these aspects. Excuse me. So here's some of the arts dealing with, here's the flagellants, of course. We see different religious orders, by the way. Shiite Muslims will commemorate an event by beating themselves with chains and whips, which the Sunnis don't do. So we do see different times this idea of punishing the body over something throughout different religions. But we can see this as a part of the kind of psychosis that was taking place during the Black Death. All right, so now what was the other things? The Mongol invasions, Genghis Khan, okay, and the rise of Ottoman Turks. So here's one thing I just want to say. For the Islamic world, the Mongols were maybe more of a threat or did more damage, one could argue, or than what the Ottomans did for the Christian world. And the Mongols affected both. But we're not going to go into long details about the Mongols and the Ottomans in a sense because this is a Western Civ course. But they definitely have to be integrated more into this because these were the real shockwave factors hitting from the outside that still reverberate into modern politics, okay? And so actually I'm going to stop here and I'm going to return to this theme and just kind of talk about how these two waves still to this day affect a lot of the kind of political consciousness of even Europeans in particular, okay? So anyway, I'll stop here and we'll turn next lecture.